Well, Jesus is continuing his streak of keeping us in the hot seat. Although, blessedly, today's reading does not have anything about weeping or gnashing of teeth, which is good because, quite frankly, there's not really room for that. What with all the deny yourself and take up your cross, and for those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it, all that stuff. Well, we'll get to that in a minute. Today's reading starts with one of the most iconic lines in the Bible, when Jesus rebukes Simon Peter by saying, "Get behind me, Satan." Funny story, at the San Diego Pride Parade a few weekends ago, directly behind our Lutherans for Love contingent was the non-theistic Satanist contingent. And one of the marchers in our group made a comment about how that was very fitting and given this particular Bible verse. Although all of us refrained from repeating Jesus' words over our shoulder, it didn't feel like that would be in keeping with the spirit of pride. But one of the things that the Satanist group kept saying over their megaphone was, "Satan loves you just the way you are." And what I wanted to say was, hey, your Satan sounds a lot like our God. We should talk. But unfortunately, the opportunity never came up. And if you're as confused about that term non-theistic Satanist as all of us were, you should Google it. Marissa actually did it during one of our staff meetings, and it's pretty interesting stuff. Anyway, back to the matter at hand. It's worth reminding all of us that when Jesus uses that word Satan, he's not referring to the red, horned, pitchfork-wielding demon guy that pops into most of our heads, thanks to how pop culture has portrayed the devil over the years. Who Jesus is actually referring to is Ha-Satan, an angel and a member of God's heavenly host, whose most notable other appearances include the book of Job and the 3 temptations that Jesus endured after his 40 days in the wilderness. So I find it really interesting that Jesus would reference this angel who was in charge of tempting people in his response to Peter, because it means that to at least a small degree, Jesus found what Peter was saying to be slightly tempting. If it wasn't the case, he could have just said, "Be quiet, Peter, you don't know what you're talking about." But by referencing Ha-Satan, it means that Jesus might have been, and maybe still was, wrestling with the notion that his ministry would inevitably end, could only end in one way, on the cross. And here I'm very careful with this kind of language because it can lead us to believe that God preordained or required Jesus' death on the cross, which is a hallmark of many different atonement theories. But I really struggle with those understandings and explanations of the cross, given who I know God to be. Because the God of love that I know doesn't align with the vengeful, vindictive God that those theories paint. And so when I say that there was no other way for Jesus' life and ministry to end, what I mean is that given what Jesus preached, given who he chose to heal and who he blessed, given how diametrically opposed his value system was to the value system of those in power, given all of those things, his death on the cross was an inevitability. It was the inevitable outcome of living in the way that he did in a world that just wasn't ready for such a radical message of peace and love and inclusivity. And like it or not, Jesus knew that. And he was trying to prepare his disciples for that inevitability, in part because it meant that they were going to be losing their teacher, but also because that wasn't how any of the disciples were expecting things to unfold. As we've talked about other times, their understanding of what the Messiah was going to do and who the Messiah was going to be was very different from what Jesus did and who Jesus was in the world. They were expecting a military leader, someone who would unite the people of Israel, drive out the occupying Roman forces, and restore Israel to glory. And what they got was Jesus. In a book on leadership that I read while I was in seminary, they define leadership as disappointing people at a rate they can bear. Let me say that again. Leadership is disappointing people. That part isn't negotiable or avoidable. You just have to figure out how to do it at a rate that people can bear. And I can think of no better explanation of Jesus' leadership style and his attempts to explain to people, sometimes gently and sometimes more forcefully, that God's ways are not our ways. And as disappointing as it might have been for them, he was going to do things God's way. And yet, we see in today's reading that even though Jesus knew what he had come to earth to do, that didn't mean that he hadn't at least contemplated what a different path might look like. We see it again in the Garden of Gethsemane when he says, "Lord, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." In my eyes, it's one of the most convincing pieces of evidence for Jesus' humanity. The fact that he had some fear, some hesitancy, some trepidation about this path that he was destined to walk. But as Carly Fiorina reminds us, courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is acting in spite of fear, which is most certainly how Jesus lived his life. Which brings us to the portion of this passage that I referenced at the beginning, a passage that has historically been used to cause a great amount of harm. I'm talking, of course, about this whole notion of denying ourselves and taking up our cross. For centuries, this passage was used to justify the idea that the suffering and hardships of life are divinely ordained. They are simply our cross to bear. It's one of those expressions that became so popular it entered the public vernacular and is often used without any kind of reference to its religious origins. It explains why these kind of things happen to us, which can definitely be helpful, but it also makes God the source of that suffering and seems to imply that suffering, that bearing our cross, is the state of being that God wants for us. It's also been used by those in power to control others and keep oppressed people in their place. Women, people of color, people of lower socioeconomic classes, and more, all told that the hardships they face, the persecution, their exploitation, their lack of rights, their lack of autonomy over their own bodies, their own lives, well, all of that is simply their cross to bear. So best to, just put on a smile, suffer in silence like Jesus did. This way of understanding this passage has served to silence any attempt at questioning whether or not the way things were actually lined up with the way God intended for them to be. But Jesus elsewhere also says that he came so that we might have abundant life, which doesn't really align with a life spent suffering under the weight of our own crosses. And while many of the early followers of Jesus would indeed be put to death for their beliefs, that just isn't the case here anymore. And so what does Jesus mean when he bids us to take up our cross? What does this understanding of discipleship mean for us? Well, in order to begin to understand that, I think we first need to look at what it meant for Jesus to take up his cross. The cross was a symbol of the power of the Roman Empire. It was a tool that they used to instill fear and to control the masses. It was a symbol of death, of subservience, a reminder to stay in your place. And God took that tool of oppression and through Jesus' death and resurrection transformed it into a symbol of hope, of new life. It became a promise that no matter what we go through, even in our darkest moments, God is with us. And so I believe that bearing our cross means bearing witness to that kind of redefining love. It means bearing witness to the world and to anyone who will listen about the radical, revolutionary, world-changing love of God, a love that can take something as terrible and brutal as the cross and transform it into something that inspires hope and love when people gaze upon it. Which means that Bearing our cross looks a lot less like suffering silently or accepting our lot in life, and it looks a whole lot more like the vision that was laid out for us in the Romans reading for today. Discipleship is not about becoming martyrs. Jesus died on the cross so that we don't have to. And we are called to be disciples to bear witness to the cross and the love that it represents. And we do that by living in the way that Paul instructs in his letter to the Romans. And there are few examples that I think better reflect what living in that way looks like than the community that Father Gregory Boyle has created up in LA at Homeboy Industries. This past Tuesday, Pastor Laura and myself, along with Alyssa and Zachy, had the honor of being invited up for the day to join the youth summer trip when they went on a tour of Homeboy Industries. Homeboy is an organization that was founded by Jesuit priest Gregory Boyle, who, by the way, we are trying to get to come speak here in January, so we will let you know if we get that done. But it was founded in 1988, and it started under the name Jobs for a Future. That was run through Father Boyle's church as a way to offer people an alternative to a life of gang affiliation and violence. And since then, it has grown into the world's largest gang rehabilitation, intervention, and re-entry program. Some of the services that they provide include therapy, educational classes, college prep, occupational and workforce training, legal assistance, tattoo removal, and so much more. It's centered around their 18-month re-entry program, and our tour guide, David, is a part of that program. He spoke about the kinship mural that's behind him, and it's hard to see, but embedded into the wings of that mural are the words hope, love, tenderness, and freedom. And he talked about how those weren't things that he was raised with, or that he had really even experienced before he came to Homeboy. And that the front doors of that building might as well have been brick walls. That's how hard walking through them felt for him. But thanks to some not so gentle encouragement from one of his tias, his aunt, who worked there, he was able to do it and has begun to build a brand new life for himself. In Father Boyle's book, Tattoos on the Heart, he says, the strategy of Jesus is not centered in taking the right stand on issues, but rather in standing in the right place with the outcast and those relegated to the margins. He continues in his most recent book, Cherished Belonging, by saying that we live in a wounded and wounding world, and that loving the wounded is never a wasted effort. Only love makes progress. Fear and negativity keep us stuck. Demonizing and dehumanizing end all conversations and shut down our hope for progress. And he has truly helped to create a place where love, mutual affection, service to your neighbor, and all of the other values listed by Paul are palpable. Everyone you walk by says hello, and they say it not in a offhanded way or in passing, but in a way that sees you, that honors and gives thanks for this opportunity to be in relationship with you. I had the particular joy of holding Zachy for much of the tour and getting to see the faces of these ex-gang members, many of whom are covered in tattoos, just light up with joy as he waved and blew kisses to them. And lest I paint too perfect of a picture, the people there are still most definitely people. We heard a few F-bombs get dropped. There were a few not very church-appropriate jokes that were made, which in my opinion only further elevates the fact that this community reflects the true values of discipleship. Because discipleship isn't about being perfect. It's not about having it all figured out and saying and doing the right thing at all the time. Discipleship is about leading with love. It's about being transformed as a result of having received the incredible, unmerited, all-encompassing love of God and being so filled with that love that it can't help but to overflow and seep out the cracks. And even with all of that, living in the way that we are called to live is hard. Look at the list that Paul rattles off in that reading from Romans. That's a lot of hard stuff to do. It is hard to bless those who persecute you. Living in harmony with one another is no small feat. Who among us hasn't claimed to be wiser than we actually are, or been tempted to repay evil for evil when someone harms us or one of our loved ones? No one said that any of this was going to be easy. And I think that ultimately that is what Jesus is trying to get at with this passage. He's trying to tell his disciples that this path, this way of living, will require them to give their all, and even then they aren't going to get it right all the time. But by bearing the cross, this symbol of death and destruction that God transformed into a beacon of hope and life, by bearing witness to that kind of love, we will begin to change the world around us for the better, to show people a different way of living and being in relationship with one another and being in relationship with themselves. Because when we bear our cross, we help remind others and ourselves just how truly cherished we are all by God. Amen.